My latest article for New Eastern Outlook is titled U.S. Seeks Superweapons to Reign as Sole Superpower. And of course, yes, this includes Russia, but more specifically, this is aimed at China. The United States sees China on the rise, and they understand very well that China is already in the process of fully surpassing the United States in every conceivable way. There's also surpassing the rest of the collective West. So it isn't just outpacing the US, but the US together with its allies still somehow have more power, more potential than China. No, China is surpassing the collective West, and there is panic, and the panic is growing. And if you have been following this for many, many years, you will have seen this process gradually intensify. So let me read this article. As usual, I read these articles for people who don't have the time, who can't or don't want to read the article, but would prefer listening to it. And as I always do, I will go into additional details when and if necessary, and I will also show you the sources that I cited in the article. So let me begin. The U.S. openly declares that it seeks to maintain a monopoly over shaping the international order following the Cold War and America's emergence from it as sole superpower. So if you remember, the end of the Cold War, the United States did indeed emerge as the most powerful nation on Earth, but they knew that there was a window of opportunity there for them to sweep aside all of the Soviet Union's partners, sweep them aside, co-opt them, capture them politically, prevent the Russian Federation, which followed the Soviet Union, from re-emerging. But there was also a long-standing policy of containing China as well. So they saw that as a window of opportunity to assert themselves over the entire planet and maintain primacy over the whole planet. So there's two documents I cited and I want to show you. The first is the 2022 National Security Strategy. And even though this was put out by the Biden administration, it is identical to every other national security strategy put out by the Trump administration and all administrations before that even. And if you look at this, you will see what the obsession is for the United States. So they're talking about contests for the future of our world, and how the administration is clear-eyed about the scope and seriousness of this challenge. The People's Republic of China harbors the intention and increasingly the capacity to reshape the international order in favor of one that tilts the global playing field to its benefit. Around the world, the need for American leadership is as great as it has ever been. We are in the midst of a strategic competition to shape the future of the international order. So the international order, essentially an order the United States created for its own benefit at the expense of everyone else on the planet Earth. They want to maintain this international order. They want to monopolize shaping it. No other nation is allowed to shape it. Even if that nation is larger, has a larger population, a larger economy, a larger military, they're not allowed to shape it. This is what the United States is saying in their current strategic planning, published publicly. Let's continue. This policy is not news. I was talking about how previous administrations have said similar things in their strategy documents. But there's a New York Times article right here. This is from 1992. U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. So this was following the Cold War, and that was U.S. foreign policy. Prevent the rise of any nation that could conceivably compete against the United States, which includes an independent Europe. Keep that in mind. So the New York Times, in a 1992 article titled U.S. Strategy Plan Calls for Ensuring No Rivals Develop, would note that the Pentagon sought to create a world dominated by one superpower whose position can be perpetuated by constructive behavior and sufficient military might to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging American primacy. And that has been the story of American foreign policy before this New York Times article was published, and ever since it has been published, up to and including today. And it will continue no matter who wins the election this year in the United States presidential election. This policy set the stage for decades of U.S. wars of aggression, political interference, regime change, U.S.-sponsored terrorism, economic sanctions, and a growing confrontation directly between the U.S. and a re-emerging Russia, as well as a rising China, all of which continues playing out to this day. Emerging from the Cold War as sole superpower, the U.S. carefully cultivated public perception through, likewise, carefully chosen conflicts, showcasing its military supremacy. While the U.S. still to this day cites its wars with Iraq in 1990 and 2003, along with the toppling of the Libyan government in 2011 as proof of its uncontested military power, in truth, both targeted nations were not nearly as powerful or as dangerous as the Western media claimed at the time. If you remember, the United States, ahead of Desert Storm in the 1990s, the early 1990s, they would repeatedly say how Iraq had the 4th largest army on earth. But of course, this was an army that had been fighting Iran for years. It was exhausted, its equipment was antiquated, its troops suffered from low morale, poor training, they were poorly organized. And again, the equipment was not only antiquated, but it was not maintained properly, and the troops were not trained to use it properly. And so all of this added up to, yes, on paper, supposedly it was the 4th largest army in the world, but in reality, it was no match for the United States and the coalition that it had put together ahead of Desert Storm. This facade has crumbled since. American primacy is now not only facing serious challenges, the premise it is based on, the notion that a single nation representing a fraction of the global population can or even should hold primacy over the rest of the planet, has been revealed as wholly unsustainable, if not self-destructive. Not only is U.S. military and economic power visibly waning, the military and economic power of China, Russia, and a growing number of other nations is rapidly growing. So the U.S. is clearly in decline, and at the same time, the rest of the world is getting stronger. China individually is getting stronger. The multipolar world that it seeks to create is getting stronger. Special interests within the U.S. pursuing global primacy do so in perpetual pursuit of wealth and power, often at the expense of many of the purposes a modern functional nation state exists to fulfill. So here we go with purpose over profit, or profit over purpose. Often this process includes the deliberate plundering of the key pillars of a modern nation state's power, which include industry, education, culture, and social harmony. This in turn only accelerates the collapse of US economic and military power. So think about education. What is the purpose of an education system? It is to prepare your population, to include your population in the process of contributing toward your nation's development. Developing new technology, improving healthcare, engineering, designing engineering and constructing infrastructure, all of these things, that is what the education system is actually supposed to do. In the United States, the education system is just another way to wring every single cent out of the American population. And it does that at the expense of actually having a well-educated, properly trained population capable of contributing to America's development. This is self-destructive. It is counterproductive. So let's now talk about how this facade post-Cold War has crumbled. Why? Why is everyone now seeing that the United States is not nearly as powerful as they had believed? And not only because it is a waning power, but just the way they were cultivating their military and economic power actually was working against them and their bid to obtain and maintain primacy over the planet. So Washington's proxy war in Ukraine has laid bare for the world to see this fundamental weakness. US weapons have proven less than capable against a peer adversary, Russia. America's expensive precision-guided artillery shells, rockets, and missiles were built in smaller numbers than their conventional counterparts, supposedly because they could achieve with just one round what several conventional rounds could. So I cite Raytheon. Here is Raytheon's official website. They're talking about the Excalibur 155 millimeter GPS-guided artillery shell. And here you see a US artillery piece firing an artillery round. And down here, it talks about, by using the Excalibur projectile's level of precision, there is a dramatic reduction in the time, cost, and logistical burden associated with other artillery munitions. Analyses have shown that on average, it can take at least 10 conventional munitions to accomplish what one Excalibur weapon can. That was the theory. That was the selling point. This is how Raytheon convinced Washington to buy these extremely expensive artillery shells in very small numbers that required minimum investment by Raytheon, thus maximizing their profit margins. But then in reality, on the battlefield in Ukraine, we can see how this theory did not add up. In the article, America's expensive precision-guided artillery shells, rockets, and missiles were built in smaller numbers than their conventional counterparts, supposedly because they could achieve with just one round what several conventional rounds could. A single US-made 155mm GPS-guided Excalibur artillery shell, for example, is claimed by Raytheon to achieve what would otherwise require 10 conventional artillery shells. The myth of quality over quantity has unraveled on and over the battlefield in Ukraine. Russia is not only capable of producing vastly more conventional weapons than the US and its European proxies, it is able to produce vastly more high-tech precision-guided weapons as well, including its own precision-guided artillery shells, the laser-guided Krasnopol, precision-guided multiple-launch rocket systems like Tornado-S, that is the Russian equivalent of HIMARS, as well as larger quantities of ballistic and cruise missiles, such as the Iskander, the Kalibr, and the KH-101. It also has to be pointed out that with artillery shells, yes, it is good to have an artillery shell that you can target and precisely hit anything on the battlefield. There's also fire for effect, where you need to cover a large area, and you don't need precision-guided artillery shells to do that. You need conventional, large numbers of conventional artillery shells, which is why Russia makes both in large quantities. The United States neglected the production of conventional weapons because of the type of warfare that had been fighting for decades as part of the war on terror. They needed to hit precisely on the battlefield. They did not need fire for effect. Russia, on the other hand, knew that it would need both, and would need both in much larger quantities. And they prepared and were prepared for this conflict in Ukraine. The United States and its Western allies were not. In other areas, Russia possesses capabilities the US does not have. Russia fields two types of hypersonic missiles, the Kinzhal hypersonic ballistic missile and the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile. Russia also possesses air and missile defenses as well as electronic warfare capabilities the US cannot match, not in quality or in quantity. If the US is unable to match or exceed the military-industrial output of Russia at the expense of losing its own proxy war in Eastern Europe, how will US designs to encircle and contain China along its own coasts unfold? China's own coasts, thousands of miles away from the United States. So let's talk about the growing disparity between the actual means the US has to achieve primacy and its dream of actually achieving primacy over the entire planet. The US military fears that any conflict with China would leave the US unprepared and vulnerable. I cite this article here, and there's many articles like this and more coming out every week now. The Air Force wants to build lots of bases around the Pacific, but it still needs to determine how to protect them. And they're talking about air and missile defense systems. Because if the United States cannot even provide enough air defense systems for Ukraine in this proxy war against Russia, how is the United States going to defend against the much larger missile arsenal of China? The US is building all of these additional bases all across the Pacific, air bases across the Pacific, because it knows that if it only has a handful of air bases, China is just going to target and wipe them out in the first wave of missile strikes. So what they want to do is create a vast number of bases across the entire Pacific and move their aircraft around. Hopefully, they imagine somehow preventing their aircraft from being wiped out by Chinese missile attacks by making it harder for China to target them all quickly enough. The problem is you have all of these bases spread out, but you don't even have enough air defenses to protect a small handful of bases, let alone this much larger number of bases. So how are they going to do that? And I don't get into that in the article, but if you read this Defense One article here, part of their strategy is pretending that they have more air defenses than they actually have. Decoys, inflatable Patriot missile systems, things like this. This is how desperate the US is. That they're not even looking at the fact that, hey, we have no capability of fighting China. It doesn't even make sense to fight China. We don't have the ability to fight China. They're still they're still determined to do it. This is something, for whatever reason, in their mind, they cannot change. And so it's an irrational objective. So it has likewise irrational solutions being devised to try to achieve it. So the US military fears that any conflict with China would leave the US unprepared and vulnerable. A recent article in Defense One titled "The Air Force Wants to Build Lots of Bases Around the Pacific, but Still Needs to Determine How to Protect Them" admits that US air missile defense systems are too expensive and too few in number to defend the growing number of US military bases being established ahead of a potential war with China. It should be remembered, however, that shortages, so we've been hearing a lot about shortages of US air and missile defenses because of the conflict in Ukraine. But if you were paying attention closely, you would have remembered that that shortage actually began before the US started shipping Patriot missile systems and other air defense systems to Ukraine. It actually began with Saudi Arabia's war, which was essentially a US proxy war against Ansar Allah in Yemen. So this was actually January 2022, a month before the special military operation began in Ukraine. Saudi Arabia may run out of interceptor missiles in months. And so this was rocket and drone attacks on Saudi Arabian infrastructure, military bases, airfields. Saudi Arabia using US-made air and missile defense systems to try to down these incoming targets and running out of missiles in the process. They had to borrow missiles from their neighbors because the US was unable to sell them additional missiles. It wasn't that they didn't have enough money. They simply don't produce enough missiles every year to supply to everyone who has ordered them and resupply those who are using them. This is a problem that they have not solved, and they're not even talking about any way to solve it anytime in the near or even intermediate future. So it should be remembered, however, that shortages of US air and missile defense systems, particularly the Patriot missile system, began before the US began sending the systems to Ukraine. The US military industrial output was unable to keep up with the demands of just Saudi Arabia amid its conflict with Ansar Allah in Yemen. Similar concerns exist regarding the number of US military aircraft, naval vessels, and the missiles each will depend on in any potential conflict with China in the Asia Pacific. So the United States, the establishment, the corporate funded think tanks that drive US foreign policy, including this desire to go to war with China, they realize that there is a growing disparity in China's favor in terms of military power. So how are they going to solve this? Understanding the large and growing disparity between US ambitions toward global primacy and its actual military means to achieve it, Washington and US-based arms manufacturers are seeking a new design and production philosophy. Well, it's new for them, but it is not new in terms of industrial production. We'll get into that in just a moment. So they have this new design and production philosophy to produce a new generation of cheaper and more numerous munitions. At the forefront of this effort are startup arms manufacturers, including Ares and Anduril. Both companies believe the US is capable of out-innovating China based on the notion that the US is somehow inherently more innovative than China. And this isn't just Ares and Anduril who believe this. This is a reoccurring theme all across US foreign policy circles. Somehow America, its economic system, just Americans in general, are inherently superior to the Chinese people. They're more creative, they're more innovative, despite all the evidence that suggests otherwise. But this is something they firmly believe. And again, all metrics are swept aside because they firmly believe that this is true. And somehow this can override the fact that all of the metrics otherwise don't add up in America's favor. Something else I want to say about startups. I have a background in industrial design. I have a lot of experience dealing with the startup community. In startup community, not everyone in the startup community, but most people in the startup community are people who seek to make as much money as fast as possible with as little effort as possible. That is their goal. Whatever it is that they've picked to try to attract investors, that comes second. The first objective is to make as much money as possible. This is a process that is entirely unsustainable. You certainly cannot run an entire national economy or an arms industry using this approach, this mentality, this philosophy. So both companies believe the US is capable of out-innovating China, based on the notion that the US is somehow inherently more innovative than China. However, their attempts to address this growing disparity reveal how disconnected US foreign policy is from the actual world it seeks to dominate. So what is going on in the actual world is one thing. What these interests think is going on and how they think they can assert primacy over this actual world that exists are two entirely different things, and there is a chasm widening between the two. So let's start with Ares. Ares wants to build cheaper, less capable, but more numerous weapons. This is their approach to solving this problem. So we have an article from the Warzone. New cheap cruise missile concept flight tested by Silicon Valley-backed startup. The need for cheaper standoff munitions that can be produced quickly at scale has jump-started a growing non-traditional weapons industry. And notice they're talking about some missile that was supposedly test-fired, but the image they choose to show us are concept art. Here is the actual quote unquote missile. You can see how small it is. This is a prototype of a prototype. So this is very far from becoming a reality. Let's read on about this. The Warzone, in an article titled New Cheap Cruise Missile Concept Flight Tested by Silicon Valley-backed Startup, explains how Ares seeks to augment America's existing arsenal of expensive but scarce long-range precision-guided missiles with smaller, cheaper, and more numerous missiles. So they're not claiming that these missiles will be as capable as existing long-range weapons the US uses. They're saying that they want to augment those with these. Smaller, cheaper missiles will be less capable than their more expensive counterparts, including Raytheon's Tomahawk cruise missile and Lockheed Martin's Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, or JASOM. There's also a long-range anti-ship missile version of JASOM. But are meant to be produced in larger quantities, because the Tomahawk and JASOM simply cannot be produced in large enough quantities to match even Russia, let alone China, let alone both. The cheaper Ares-built missiles will be used for lower priority targets, while their more capable but less numerous counterparts are used for critical targets. Even if they were able to do this exactly as they planned, this still would not work. The article claims Ares does not yet appear to have released any hard specifications because they're testing a prototype of a prototype. They have nothing even close to an actual missile yet, current or planned, but says that it is targeting a $300,000 unit cost for its missiles. Well, that is significantly cheaper than any of these other long-range missiles that the United States is building. But is $300,000 US dollars cheap for the long-range precision-guided weapons that, say, Russia or China are making? Remember that Russia and China have state-owned enterprises handling arms production. The purpose of these state-owned enterprises is to produce what the state needs to defend itself, not to make profits. They need to make profits for this whole process to be sustainable, but that is a secondary priority. The primary objective of these state-owned enterprises is to produce vast quantities of effective weapons for the state to use to defend itself. In addition to how far off from reality Ares missiles actually are from seeing the battlefield, even the stated goal of building these missiles for $300,000 each seems to fall far short of the sort of revolutionary innovation required to meet or exceed even Russia's military-industrial production, let alone China's. So it's very interesting. I came across an article by Ukrainian media, Defense Express. Please note the date, November 1st, 2022. So this was toward the end of the first year of the special military operation. What is the real price of Russian missiles? And you can tell that this is very pro-Ukrainian media because their animosity to Russia is so great that they very childishly, unprofessionally use lowercase r when referring to Russia or anything that is Russian. And they're talking about the cost of the Kalibr and KH-101 and also Iskander ballistic missiles. So 2 cruise missiles and a ground-launched ballistic missile. they would place the cost of the Kalibr cruise missile somewhere between $300,000 and $1 million. This is vastly cheaper than comparable missiles produced in the West. It's also comparable to the cheap but less capable missiles that Ares is proposing to manufacture. So even before Ares produces its first missile for the US government, its objective from the very start is not even going to exceed what Russia is already doing on a much larger scale. Well, I get into that here in the article. So while the 2022 article was easy to dismiss at the time amid Western headlines claiming Russian missile stockpiles were exhausted, since then it has been admitted by the same Western media that Russia is firing over 4,000 missiles at targets across Ukraine each year, and that number increases. This suggests Russian missile production is as economical as it is vast. And again, I just want to point out this article from February this year, 2024. Ukraine says Russia has launched over 8,000 missiles and over 4,630 drones during the war. So from February 2022 to February 2024, 8,000 missiles, over 4,600 drones. In 2022, the Western media was talking about how costly Russian missiles were, and the fact that they were running out, and that they would exhaust their stockpiles and they would not be able to replace these missiles, and that the barrages of missiles would end any day. If you remember, that was the narrative for some time. The missile barrages increased in scale and frequency, up to and including today, where Russia is still launching unprecedented attacks almost week to week now. That would not be possible if Russian missiles were as expensive as US missiles. So they are very obviously producing these at a vastly lower cost than the US is. And it is a cost most likely as low as Ares proposes for their less capable missiles that they plan on producing and selling to the US government. So thus, even before Ares produces its first missile, the very premise of what it is trying to achieve falls far short of what Russia's military-industrial base is already doing on a vast scale, saying nothing of what China's military-industrial base is capable of. So whatever Russia is capable of doing, China is able to do on a larger scale and more efficiently than even Russia. There is also the reality that in addition to higher-end munitions costing as little as Ares' proposed lower-end missiles, both Russia and China are perfectly capable of augmenting their existing arsenals with even cheaper, less sophisticated munitions as well. How do we know this? Because Russia is already doing this. Russia's deployment of its UMPK-fitted Fab series glide bombs is a perfect example of this. The guided glide bombs went from concept to mass production over the course of the special military operation. They did have glide bombs, these guidance kits that they are including with the glide bombs. This is something that, as far as I can tell, is relatively recent and specifically being used during the special military operation. They had guided bombs that they had used in Syria, but I think the concept of a guided glide bomb, this is something that is more recent. With improvements made based on their performance in combat, providing a cheaper, more numerous, yet still effective alternative to more expensive long-range precision-guided munitions. In many ways, what Ares is attempting to do is a poor imitation of what Russia and China have already done and will continue doing, and will continue doing on a larger scale than the US is capable of. There is a fundamental problem that the United States refuses to even face, let alone solve. They will not even acknowledge that this is a problem, let alone work towards solving it. And that is the fact that America's arms industry is profit-driven. It puts profit over purpose. If it comes down to producing enough weapons to meet US needs at the expense of profit, it just simply won't be done. We can see that it's not being done, even though there is this need for cheaper, more numerous weapons. The US arms industry isn't doing it. And there is no talk in the US of nationalizing these arms manufacturers, turning them into efficient state-owned enterprises. There's no talk of even doing that. And even if they set out to do that, that would take some time to implement. Meanwhile, Russia and China continue building their lead over the United States. So that's Ares. Their idea of cheaper, less capable, but more numerous missiles already makes no sense before they even produce their first functioning missile. What about Anduril? Anduril believes that it can out-innovate China and Russia. So like Ares, US-based arms manufacturer Anduril imagines cheaper and more numerous systems can help even the odds as Russia outproduces the West amid the conflict in Ukraine, and as China's production of warplanes, ships, and missiles surpasses the US and its European proxies. And I have mentioned in previous articles and videos the vast disparity between Chinese shipbuilding and American shipbuilding. It is stark. Anduril proposes achieving this through software-defined manufacturing, a process it claims allowed electric vehicle manufacturer Tesla to build better and more numerous vehicles than legacy car manufacturers by building its vehicle around its own in-house software and electronics. So what Tesla would do is create all of its software and electronics itself and then build the hardware of the vehicle around that. The way legacy car manufacturers do it is they have the physical car that they have built, and then they outsource the software to other companies, sometimes a number of companies. I get into that. The advantage is clear. Legacy car manufacturers build the physical cars themselves, but many of the subsystems are outsourced to other companies, including the operating system used by modern cars, as well as sensors and other electronic components and subsystems. Often this collection of software, sensors, and other components is outsourced to a large number of different companies. Any change in the car's design requires working with this large number of other companies, making modifications and improvements cumbersome. By including all subsystems within a single in-house developed software and building the hardware around it, changes can be done faster and larger quantities of higher quality cars can be made more rapidly as a result. And Tesla is a living example of that. It has outpaced electric vehicle manufacturing across the rest of the West. One place it is not outpacing electric vehicle production is in China. I wonder why that is. Anduril imagines using the same process to build vast numbers of drones, missiles, and other weapons and munitions, matching or even outpacing China. The problem for Anduril is that software-defined manufacturing is already extensively used by China's vast and advanced industrial base, including its electric vehicle manufacturing. A lot of its electric vehicles are made using this very same process. With this advantage rendered moot, the US finds itself again at a severe disadvantage. Not only is China capable of producing conventional military arms, ammunition, and equipment in vastly greater quantities than the US, it is also able to build advanced, rapidly improved software-defined systems like drones and missiles. Like the systems Anduril believes that it somehow can make, and China has no way of matching them. This is a fantasy. This means anything the US attempts to do, China is capable of doing better and on a vastly greater scale. And again, this all comes down to fundamentals. China's fundamentals are vastly stronger than America's. And America's fundamentals are weak because of a specific mindset that is so deeply rooted in the establishment. It really cannot be changed. It will not be changed anytime soon. So let's talk about the flawed premise America has built its ambitions for global primacy on top of. The premise Ares and Anduril operate from is fundamentally flawed. Both companies, like the circles of special interest they serve on Wall Street and in Washington, believe the US is inherently superior to its adversaries like Russia and China. In their collective minds, any disadvantage the US finds itself with is incidental, and overcoming it is merely a matter of summoning sufficient political will. Russia and China having larger and more capable industrial bases is seen as a temporary lapse in America's own political focus and willpower. And by taking steps to expand America's own industrial base, the US will inevitably find itself on top again. That is what they believe. That is what they are writing in the pages of their policy papers. By the way, Anduril produced a whole document about this, how they're going to use software-enabled manufacturing toward hyperscale production. And this will be in the video. This link will be in the video description below. And you can see that throughout this report, they're using concept art. Again, there's nothing real to any of this. They're using concept art, they're using historical images that are irrelevant. The only thing they got right was this graphic depicting Chinese shipbuilding here on the right and US shipbuilding here on the left, the disparity between the two, clear for all to see. So the premise Ares and Anduril operate from is fundamentally flawed. Both companies believe the US is inherently superior to Russia and China. In their collective minds, any disadvantage the US finds itself with is incidental, and overcoming it is merely a matter of summoning sufficient political will. And we hear this over and over again regarding Ukraine. Despite all the metrics that we can see showing Russia having the advantage, many in the collective West believe it's just a matter of spending more, wanting to make more munitions. But there's so much more to it than that. In reality, Russia and China's industrial bases are larger than America's because of a number of factors, including factors no amount of American political will can overcome. China, in particular, has a population 4 times greater than the US. China graduates millions more each year in the fields of science, technology, engineering, mathematics than the US. And the physical size of its industrial base, military or otherwise, reflects this demographic disparity. And I know I've showed this many times before, and this is actually from 2016, not as if it has improved in America's favor since then. These are the countries with the most science, technology, engineering, and mathematics graduates as of 2016, China with 4.7 million, the US with 568,000, Russia with a much smaller population, almost comparable number of STEM graduates. Look at that. So does anyone believe the United States could somehow outproduce and out-innovate Russia and China combined? It is a fantasy. Even if the US had the political will to reform its military-industrial base, stripping away profit-driven private industry and replacing it with purpose-driven state-owned enterprises, even if the US likewise transformed its education system to produce a skilled workforce rather than squeeze every penny from American students, and even if the US invested in its national infrastructure, a fundamental prerequisite for expanding its industrial base, it still faces a reality where China has already done all of this and done so with a population larger than it and its G7 partners combined. The premise that the US, representing less than 5% of the global population, should maintain primacy over the other 95% is fundamentally flawed. And if this is where you're starting, everything else you try to do, no matter what it is going to be tilted far, far away from reality and far, far away from anything that is actually achievable. Unless Americans are truly inherently superior to the rest of the world, which they are not. Achieving primacy over the world can only be done by dividing and destroying the other 95% of the world's population. In many ways, this is what has defined generations of Western hegemony over the planet and is what Washington has set out to do today. And if you study Western imperialism, the British Empire, and then America's rise, divide and conquer. This is what the British Empire had done all around the world. They're dividing and conquering targeted nations and peoples. This is something that lives on today. If you look at India or Bangladesh, which I had covered recently, Myanmar, Malaysia, you can see the deep divisions in these societies. These are legacies of British imperialism. This is something that a lot of these countries have failed to overcome. The only country that I could think of that has really overcome this is Singapore, but it was a very hard-fought battle to do so. The United States seeks to do this today. You can look at all of their interference around the globe. It is always to create divisions inside a targeted nation, build up an opposition to divide and destroy the targeted country. Despite this, the rest of the world has caught up in terms of economics. So even with the US doing this, the rest of the world is still catching up anyway in terms of technology, which drives economic and military power. So despite this, the rest of the world has caught up in terms of economic and military power, precisely because the US is not inherently superior. Western hegemony was a historical anomaly, not proof of the West's superiority. superiority, with the rest of the world having caught up in terms of economic and military power, and with numbers on their side, the next century will be determined by a multipolar world. For this emerging multipolar world, the factors that have given its rise, which include a geopolitical balance of power built on cooperation over conflict, industry and infrastructure driven by purpose over profit, and progress built by practical education and hard work over the blind pursuit of power and profit, must be firmly cemented as the fundamental principles of this new world, or it's going to slide back into this so-called international order the US has created. Should the multipolar world weather US attempts to divide and destroy it and continue investing in the principles that gave rise to it in the first place, no type of US-made super weapon can overcome it. And of course, I did not write this in the article. That is the end of the article. But another point that I often make is that for the US, we can clearly see they have this unobtainable objective of obtaining, maintaining global primacy, subjugating the other over 95% of the planet. What the US actually needs to do is accept that it is not the most powerful nation on Earth. It will not ever be the most powerful nation on Earth. What it needs to do is recognize that it will just be one of many large, powerful nations on Earth. Find a constructive role to play with all other nations of the world rather than this continuous and futile attempt and self-destructive attempt to impose itself on the rest of the world. And so on that, I think this is very clear. This is where the actual battle lines are drawn. It is really a battle between Western special interests seeking global primacy and a multipolar world that seeks a global balance of power. Don't get too deeply into any specific conflict that is being fought as part of this wider struggle. Always zoom out and see the bigger picture. Don't become overly obsessed with any one of these conflicts, which includes the war in Ukraine, this building of tensions here in the Asia Pacific, the conflict in Bangladesh, the different examples of political interference, US political interference here in Southeast Asia. Also, all of the conflicts in the Middle East are a result of this larger struggle playing out. People get deeply invested and obsessed with Israel's war with all of its neighbors, essentially. And they lose sight to the fact that that is just one of several proxy wars the US is waging around the world, and that comes to their detriment and the detriment of all of us working together to build up a balance of power in a multipolar world versus trying to end this American hegemony, this destructive hegemony that it has wielded for generations, trying to make this transition as peacefully and with as little death and destruction as possible. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this. If you thought this video in particular was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Absolutely everything is on Telegram. So if you follow me on Telegram, you will see all of my videos, all of my articles posted there, including backups of all of my videos that I have on YouTube. I also post all of my videos on Rumble, so check out my Rumble channel if you don't feel like watching my videos on YouTube or Telegram. In the video description below are all of the links to everything that I cited, including the NEO article itself. There are also ways in the video description below to help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms, not my YouTube channel, not Rumble. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no extra resources and you're just helping share my work with others, all of that is greatly appreciated. That is what makes all of this work possible, so thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.